The rich rancher came to collect a debt, but found a young widow nursing 5 children. A hardened rancher arrives at a remote homestead to collect a debt from his late partner, only to find the man's widow and 5 children on the brink of starvation. Forced to shelter from a brutal winter, their initial hostility thaws into an unexpected partnership, revealing secrets that will change all their lives forever. The Wyoming wind didn't so much blow as it did scour, a relentless, grit-laden force that had long since worn the color from the grass and the hope from the land. It was the kind of wind that spoke of endless space and profound isolation, a whisper that could drive a man mad if he listened too long. Jacob Thorne was a man who preferred numbers to whispers. They were solid, quantifiable. A debt was a debt. A partnership was a partnership. He reined in his bay gelding at the crest of a low rise, his slate-colored eyes taking in the scene below with the cold efficiency of an accountant reviewing a ledger. This was it. The Cedar Creek Valley venture. The words, once full of the promise Michael Harris had painted in his letters, now tasted like ash. The homestead was a portrait of defeat. A log cabin, slumped against the elements like a tired old man, its chinking falling away in gray crumbs. An empty corral, its fence posts leaning at forlorn angles. A single, stubborn aspen tree rattled its bare branches by the door, a skeletal sentinel. There was no smoke from the chimney, only a thin, desperate wisp that the wind tore to shreds before it could rise. Jacob nudged his horse forward, the animal's hooves crunching on the frozen ground. He dismounted at what passed for a woodpile, his fine duster, dusty from miles of travel, flapping around his boots. He towed a piece of wood with his boot. It was not split log, but a rotten branch that disintegrated into soft, punky decay. His jaw tightened. This was not the industry of a thriving partner. A sound, faint and carried on the wind, made him still. It was the fretful cry of an infant. The numbers in his ledger shifted, complicated by a variable he hadn't accounted for. He pushed the thought aside. Business was business. He approached the door and knocked, the sound sharp and alien against the moaning landscape. Silence. Then, from within, a hushed scramble, the sound of a heavy bolt being drawn. The door opened a crack just wide enough to reveal a sliver of a woman's face, pale and etched with a weariness that went deeper than bone. Yes. Her voice was raspy, worn thin. What do you want? I'm looking for Michael Harris. The name acted like a physical blow. She flinched, her hand, chapped and red, tightening on the edge of the door. Her eyes, a startling blue despite their exhaustion, widened for a fraction of a second before shuttering closed. The door opened wider, revealing the dim interior and the small, huddled shapes of 3 more children clustered behind her skirts like frightened chicks. Michael is dead, she said, the words flat and final. Fever. 2 months back. He's in the ground behind the ridge. Jacob absorbed this. He didn't feel grief. Michael was a business associate, not a friend, but a cold spike of frustration. This was a complication. A significant one. My name is Jacob Thorne. Michael and I were business partners. He saw the blank confusion on her face. She knew nothing of him. He was supposed to be running a herd up here. Building an operation. A bitter, hollow sound escaped her. It might have been a laugh once. The venture. The herd is gone. What the wolves and the cold didn't get, he sold off. Piece by piece. To get us through the winter after the drought. The numbers in his mind began to scream in protest. He unbuttoned his duster, the movement deliberate, and drew out the leather-bound ledger. It was his Bible, his truth. He opened it to a page marked with a ribbon, the figures neat and unwavering. According to our books, he said, his voice as steady as the numbers on the page, Michael took a significant investment from me. $500 for seed stock and 50 head of prime cattle. That debt remains unpaid. He held the ledger out, the evidence indisputable. The numbers were a stark, black and white reality in her world of gray, crushing hardship. For a moment, the woman, Eliza Harris, just stared at the ledger as if it were a venomous snake. Then, the exhaustion in her face was burned away by a raw, kindling fury. The infant in her arms, sensing the shift, began to whimper. There is no money, Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice trembling with the effort to keep it low. There are no cattle. There is only me, my 5 children, and the food in our pantry, which won't last the week. You've had a wasted journey. She moved to shut the door, a final, desperate act of preservation. But Jacob's arm shot out, his gloved hand pressing flat against the rough wood, stopping it with an effortless strength that felt, in that moment, monstrous. A debt isn't erased by misfortune, Mrs. Harris, he said, the words cold and hard as river stone. It transfers. The accusation in her eyes then could have scorched the earth. She looked from his implacable face to the ledger, then back to the wide, fearful eyes of her children. The fight seemed to drain out of her all at once, leaving behind a profound and terrifying resignation. "Then take it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Take the roof over our heads. Take the last sack of flour. Take the clothes off our backs. Take it all and be on your way." She drew a shaky breath, her gaze locking with his, blazing with a final, defiant truth. "But know that you are collecting from the graves of your partner and his children. Is that the business you are in, Mr. Thorne? Grave robbing?" The word hung in the air between them, ugly and undeniable. For the first time, the numbers in Jacob's ledger felt flimsy, insubstantial against the weight of her reality. He looked past her, into the shadows of the cabin, and saw the patched quilts, the hollow cheeks of the children, the utter void of anything resembling the prosperity his money was meant to create. Before he could form a response, a small boy of about 6 emerged from behind a stool. He had a rattling cough that shook his thin frame. He didn't look at Jacob with fear, but with a simple, profound curiosity. "Mama," the boy said, his voice a small dry leaf in the wind. "I'm hungry." The statement was a verdict. It was the final, unanswerable argument that no ledger could ever contain. And as if in solemn agreement, the sky finally opened, releasing the first heavy, wet snowflakes of the coming storm. They fell silently, landing on the open page of Jacob's ledger, where they began to bleed the ink of the debt he had come so far to collect. The wind, which had been a persistent moan at the door, now took on a sharper, keening edge. The first few snowflakes that had landed on Jacob's ledger were now a relentless, swirling curtain of white, blurring the line between earth and sky. The world beyond the cabin door was vanishing, and with it, Jacob's immediate escape route. Eliza Harris watched the storm's escalation over his shoulder, her expression not of surprise, but of grim resignation. This was the way of this land. It offered no reprieve, only a succession of trials. The blizzard was simply the next one in line. "You can't possibly mean to travel in this," she said, her voice flat, drained of the fiery defiance she'd mustered moments before. It was a simple statement of fact. Jacob Thorne did not reply immediately. He stood with his back to her, a broad, dark silhouette against the growing whiteness outside, his hand still resting on the doorframe where he had stopped her from closing him out. The ledger was tucked back inside his coat, a cold, hard rectangle against his chest. He was a man of action, of decisions, and in the span of a few minutes, his clear-cut mission had been buried under a heap of complicating humanity and now, a literal mountain of snow. He turned, his gaze sweeping the cabin once more, but this time with a different purpose. Not assessment for collection but for survival. His eyes catalogued the feeble fire, the drawn, pale faces of the children, the way the baby's breath plumed in the rapidly cooling air. "You can't possibly survive the winter here," he countered, his voice low. It wasn't concern that drove the statement, but a pragmatic analysis of their resources, which his quick inventory told him were virtually non-existent. "We have no choice," Eliza replied, her arms tightening around the infant Maggie, who had settled into a fitful, whimpering sleep. "There's a town. Cedar Creek. 30 miles south." A bitter, almost imperceptible smile touched Eliza's lips. "With what supplies? With what money? We'd freeze on the trail, Mr. Thorne. This," she gestured around the cramped, poor space, "is our best chance. For now." A particularly violent gust of wind slammed against the cabin, shaking the door in its frame and sending a fine dust of snow sifting through the gaps in the roof chinking. The children flinched. The little boy Tommy began to cough again, a dry, rasping sound that seemed to tear at his small lungs. Jacob's jaw worked. Every instinct, every fiber of his disciplined being, screamed at him to settle his business and leave. But the arithmetic was inescapable. Leaving now, in the teeth of a Wyoming blizzard, was suicide. And staying meant accepting a temporary and deeply uncomfortable truce. He was trapped. Not by the woman, not by the debt, but by the raw, unbiased tyranny of nature. His principles were formidable, but they were no match for a storm that could freeze a man solid in an hour. He let out a long, slow breath, the plume of white in the cold air a testament to the losing battle of the fireplace. He turned fully to face her, his expression a mask of grudging acceptance. "The storm is too severe to travel," he announced, the words tasting foreign. "I will wait it out." Eliza gave a single sharp nod. No words of welcome, no false courtesy. She understood the unspoken agreement perfectly. He was a prisoner of the weather and she was a prisoner of his presence. They were captives together in this tiny, fragile ark against the snow. "Annie," Eliza said, her voice regaining some of its command, "get the blanket for the baby. Tommy, come away from the door, you're letting the cold in." Jacob moved from the doorway, his large frame making the cabin feel suddenly, acutely smaller. He shrugged out of his heavy duster, revealing a simple wool shirt and a leather vest. He folded the coat with a precise, military neatness and laid it over a lone, splintered stool. The action, so controlled and out of place, emphasized the chaos of the surrounding poverty. He stood awkwardly for a moment, a predator in a dovecot, before taking a seat on the packed earth floor near the fireplace, his back against a log wall. He had no claim to the rough-hewn furniture, the family meager stools and single bed. Eliza moved to the hearth, adding a few more of the paltry sticks to the fire. It was a calculated risk, burning their fuel with a stranger present, but the cold was becoming a more immediate threat than he was. She then took a dented pot from a hook and scooped some water into it from a barrel, adding a handful of oats and a pinch of salt. The meager supper was begun. The cabin fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire, the wind's scream and Tommy's rattling cough. The children watched Jacob, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a strange, weary curiosity. He was the most interesting thing to happen in weeks, even if he was a danger. Jacob met the gaze of the little girl, Annie. She didn't look away like the others. She studied him, her head tilted as if trying to decipher a difficult text. He was the man who had come to take their home, but now he was sitting on their floor, a captive audience to their hardship. The logic of it clearly puzzled her. He looked away toward the small high window. The glass was completely frosted over, a blank white slate. The storm had fully enclosed them. The outside world, with its ledgers and debts and his orderly ranch, was gone. There was only this: the close, cold air, the scent of poverty and boiling oats, the sound of a family trying not to break, and the silent, imposing figure of the man who had, for now, called a halt to his own war of attrition. The game had changed. The collection was postponed. For the duration of the storm they were all simply trying to survive. The blizzard held the little cabin in a furious, white grip for 2 days. Time seemed to suspend itself in the howling gray whiteness outside the frosted window. Inside, the world shrunk to the radius of the firelight, a bubble of fragile warmth and profound tension. Jacob Thorne was a man of wide horizons and decisive action. Confinement was a slow agony. He spent the first day in a state of restless observation, a spectator to a life of struggle he could scarcely comprehend. He watched Eliza's relentless, weary orbit, the nursing of the baby, the quiet soothing of the twins, the doling out of meager portions of thin broth that was little more than flavored water. He saw how Annie, a child of 8, had the eyes and duties of a woman, constantly tidying, shushing her brothers and casting suspicious glances his way. He was a statue in their midst, his stillness a stark contrast to their necessary motion. The ledger in his coat felt heavier each hour, its numbers becoming meaningless glyphs in the face of Tommy's worsening cough and the visible hollows in the children's cheeks. On the second morning, driven by a need to do something, to exert control over some small part of this chaotic situation, his gaze fell upon an old, broken dresser shoved into a corner. It was a sorry piece of furniture, one drawer missing, the wood warped and splintered. Useless. But it was wood. Without a word he stood up. The sudden movement made everyone freeze. Eliza instinctively pulled the twins closer, her body tensed like a spring. He ignored her, his focus on the dresser. He picked it up, its lightness speaking of its dry, brittle nature, and carried it outside into the shrieking wind. XD. Cabin day. The cold was a physical blow. Snow swirled around him, stinging his face. He set the dresser down in the lee of the cabin, braced it with his boot, and raised the axe he had taken from beside the door. The first blow was a release of pent-up frustration, a sharp crack that was swallowed by the storm. He worked with a brutal, practiced efficiency, reducing the dresser to a pile of kindling and manageable splits. His breath plumed in ragged gusts, his muscles, accustomed to hard labor, singing a familiar, satisfying song. Cabin, continuous. Inside, the children flinched with each thunderous blow. Annie looked at her mother, her eyes wide with fear. "Is he breaking our things, Mama?" Eliza listened, her expression unreadable. The sounds weren't of mindless destruction, but of purposeful, rhythmic work. After a few minutes, Jacob stomped back inside, his shoulders and hat dusted with snow, his arms laden with fresh-cut wood. He didn't look at them. He went straight to the hearth, knelt and began to rebuild the fire. He used the splintered kindling from the dresser, arranging it with an artisan's care, creating a structure that would draw properly. He added a few of the larger splits. The feeble, dying flames caught the dry wood, licked at it, and then surged to life with a hungry, roaring crackle. A new, different warmth began to radiate into the room, a deep, penetrating heat they hadn't felt in weeks. The orange glow painted the walls, chasing the deep shadows from the corners. The twins, mesmerized, inched closer, their small hands outstretched to the blessed heat. It was the first tangible improvement since his arrival, and it was he who had made it. Eliza said nothing, but her eyes, watching his broad back as he tended the fire, held a flicker of something other than hostility, a wary, reluctant reassessment. Later, as he was stacking the remaining wood neatly by the fireplace, his hand brushed against something small and carved tucked within the pile. He pulled it out. It was a little wooden horse, crudely but lovingly shaped, its mane and tail suggested by knife strokes. Toy. Michael's work, no doubt. Tommy was watching him, his coughing fit having subsided into a weary wheeze. Jacob looked from the toy to the boy's gaunt face. He didn't smile. He simply walked over and held it out. Tommy stared at the horse, then at the formidable stranger, his expression a mixture of fear and longing. Go on. Jacob's voice was low, not quite gentle but devoid of its usual edge. Tommy took the horse, his small fingers closing around it. He didn't smile, but he looked at Jacob, and for the first time, it wasn't with fear, but with a dawning, quiet gratitude. That night, the cabin was warmer than it had been in a long time. The wind still screamed its outrage, but it felt more distant, held at bay by the robust fire. The children slept more soundly, their bodies unclenching from the cold. Tommy slept with the wooden horse clutched in his hand. Jacob lay on his bedroll, staring at the firelit ceiling. He could hear the soft, rhythmic sounds of Eliza settling the baby. Then silence. And then another sound. It started as a hitch in her breath, a strangled gasp she tried to smother in her pillow. Then it came, a wave of silent, shuddering sobs that racked her frame. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of a strength that had been stretched to its absolute limit finally fraying into threads. It was the sound of grief for a husband, of terror for her children, of utter, soul-crushing exhaustion. She cried without making a loud noise, which made it all the more devastating. Jacob did not move. He did not call out. He offered no comfort, for what comfort could he, the author of this latest threat, possibly give? He simply lay there in the dark, forced to listen. Each stifled sob was a chisel strike against the granite of his resolve. The numbers in the ledger, the principle of the debt, the memory of Michael's failings, they all seemed to shrink and blur in the face of this raw human sorrow. He was a rancher, a man who understood assets and liabilities. But listening to Eliza Harris cry in the dark, Jacob Thorne began to fear that he had profoundly miscalculated the worth of a soul, and the devastating cost of collecting what he was owed. The world outside had been remade in white. The blizzard, having spent its fury, left behind a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure on the ears. Sunlight, sharp and brilliant, glared off a landscape of unbroken snow, sculpting the prairie into soft, blinding dunes. The cabin, once a lonely outpost, was now the center of a vast, frozen sea. Jacob was the first to stir, pushing open the door against a deep drift. The air was knife-cold and clean, scouring the lingering sense of despair from the cabin. He stood on the threshold, surveying the aftermath. His horse, a dark shape in the sheltered lee of the corral, whickered softly. The trail he had ridden in on was gone, erased as if it had never been. He didn't wait for the family to wake. The restless energy that had plagued him during the storm now found its outlet. He took up the axe again, not for destruction but for creation. The steady, rhythmic thwack of the blade biting into a frozen log from the old woodpile became the morning's metronome. He was clearing a path, building a woodpile that was not just for emergency warmth, but for sustenance. Inside, Eliza watched him through the window, the baby nestled in the crook of her arm. She saw the power in his shoulders, the efficiency of his movements. This was not the act of a man preparing to leave. It was the act of a man digging in. A knot of dread tightened in her stomach. The storm was over. The reckoning was now. When the children were awake and huddled around the revived fire, she pulled on her thin shawl and stepped outside. The cold stole her breath. Jacob had cleared a small area, and a respectable stack of split pine was growing beside him. He didn't stop his work as she approached, but he acknowledged her with a slight tilt of his head. "The storm is over," she said, her voice firm, stating the undeniable. "You can leave." He sank the axe into the chopping block with a final, solid thunk. He turned, his gaze sweeping from her determined face to the endless, impassable white that stretched to the horizon. "The snow is 3 feet deep," he replied, his tone flat. "My horse wouldn't make it a mile. The passes will be blocked for days, maybe weeks." "Then what is your plan, Mr. Thorne?" The question was a challenge, laced with the fear she could not fully conceal. "To sit by our fire and watch us slowly starve? To wait until the last crumb is gone so you can formally repossess our corpses?" Jacob wiped his brow with the back of his glove, his eyes meeting hers. They were not as hard as they had been 2 days ago. They held a new, calculating light, one that was looking forward, not just at a balance sheet. "I have a proposal," he said. "Not out of charity. A business arrangement." Eliza crossed her arms, her skepticism a visible shield. "I'm listening." "I will stay," he began, the words deliberate. "I will use my strength and what knowledge I have to see this family through the winter. I will hunt. I will repair what I can. I will ensure you have firewood and that this cabin stands against the next storm." He paused, letting the offer hang in the frozen air. It was everything she needed, offered by the last person on earth she wanted to accept it from. "And in return?" she asked, her voice tight. "In return," he continued, "you will work this land with me come spring. We will rebuild what Michael lost. We will plant, we will fence, we will build a herd again. The debt will be paid not in cash but in labor and the success of this farm. A 50-50 partnership. You work for your share and I work for mine. The debt is considered paid when the farm is self-sustaining." Eliza stared at him, trying to find the trap. It was a lifeline, but it was woven from the same rope he had almost used to hang them. It meant his presence, his authority, woven into the fabric of their lives for months. It meant trusting the man who had come to destroy them. "You would do that?" she whispered, the question laden with a history of betrayal. "After you came to take everything?" A muscle in his jaw twitched. "I am a businessman, Mrs. Harris. A dead family is a poor investment. They yield no return. A functioning farm is an asset. It is simple arithmetic." But as he said it, his eyes flickered toward the cabin window, where little Tommy's face was pressed against the glass, his breath fogging a small circle. The arithmetic, she suspected, was no longer quite so simple. She thought of the empty pantry. She thought of Tommy's cough, of the twins' quiet listlessness. She thought of the sheer, back-breaking impossibility of facing the rest of this winter alone. Pride was a luxury for the well-fed. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the cold air sharp in her lungs. "We keep the home," she stated, her terms clear and non-negotiable. "This land, this cabin. No matter what. The children and I are not turned out. It remains in our name." Jacob held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a single, curt nod. "Agreed." Eliza Harris, widow, mother of 5, extended her hand. It was bare, chapped red and rough from work. Jacob Thorne, rancher, creditor, looked at it, then removed his own heavy leather glove. His hand, when it closed around hers, was warm and calloused, his grip firm and sure. It was not a gentle handshake, but it was an honest one. A deal was struck. As they released their grip, the first true weak ray of winter sun broke through the high clouds, glinting off the axe blade embedded in the wood. It was no longer just a tool for survival, but an instrument of a shared, uncertain future. A new, tentative rhythm established itself in the cabin, a rhythm dictated not by the stark terms of a debt, but by the shared, grinding work of survival. The arithmetic of the ledger was slowly being replaced by a different calculus. The weight of a full woodpile, the warmth of a well-banked fire, the quiet satisfaction of a patched roof that no longer leaked snow. Jacob's presence, once a dark shadow in the corner, became a constant, productive force. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke in a loud, clear voice. He spent a morning with a hammer and a handful of salvaged nails, silently reinforcing the doorframe and sealing the worst of the wind's entry points. He took the rifle, a fine Winchester that seemed as out of place as he was, and vanished into the stark, white silence of the woods for hours. Eliza watched him go with a knot of conflicting emotions. Each time, a part of her wondered if he would simply keep walking back to his own life, leaving them to their fate. Another, more fearful part, wondered if he would return empty-handed, proving the land's barrenness and the futility of their bargain. But he did return. On the third day, as the late afternoon light was bleeding from the sky, he emerged from the tree line. Slung over his shoulder was not a grand deer, but a large snowshoe hare, its white winter coat stark against his dark clothing. It was not a king's feast, but it was life. It was fresh red meat. That evening, the cabin was filled with a scent that had become a distant memory, the rich, savory aroma of roasting game. The stew Eliza made was thick, the broth opaque with nourishment. The children, who had been listless, now hovered near the hearth, their eyes fixed on the pot with a focus that was almost painful to witness. When the meal was served, the silence that fell was one of profound concentration, broken only by the sound of spoons scraping against bowls. Then a miracle occurred. Tommy, his belly full for the first time in weeks, looked across at Jacob, who was eating his portion with the same quiet efficiency, and let out a small, genuine laugh at something his sister whispered. The sound was so foreign, so pure and unburdened, that it seemed to hang in the air, a tiny, defiant bell tolling against the silence of hardship. Jacob did not smile in return, but the severe line of his mouth softened almost imperceptibly. He gave the boy a slow, deliberate nod, as if acknowledging a solemn point in a conversation. Later, with the children settled and the baby asleep, a rare quiet descended. Jacob was sitting by the fire, using a sharp knife and a piece of harness leather to practice his mending. Eliza, emboldened by the full bellies and the unaccustomed warmth, sat in the rocking chair nearby, a torn shirt of Michael's in her lap. The fire cast dancing shadows on their faces, its crackle a comfortable accompaniment to the silence. "Michael," she began, her voice soft, not looking up from her darning. "He wasn't a bad man." It was a statement she felt she needed to make, a eulogy for the man whose ghost stood between them. Jacob paused his work, the knife still in his hand. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the flames. "He was a dreamer," she continued, her needle moving in and out of the worn fabric. "He could look at this piece of land and see a kingdom. Fields of wheat, herds of cattle as far as the eye could see. He could paint the future with his words until you could almost believe you were living in it." She sighed, a soft, weary sound. But he was better with ideas than with accounts. The numbers, they frustrated him. The drought last summer, it didn't just kill the crops. It killed the dream in him. He kept writing to you, I think. Drafts of letters were scattered on his desk. But he never sent them. He was too ashamed. She finally chanced to look at him. His profile was sharp in the firelight, his thoughts turned inward. A long moment passed, the confession settling between them like dust. Then Jacob spoke, his voice low and roughened by the memory. "Michael and I," he started, then stopped, choosing his words with care. "We had a falling out. Years ago. It was over a woman." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "A foolish thing. I thought he had betrayed me. My trust. When he came to me with this plan for the Cedar Creek Valley venture, I saw it as a way to be rid of him. To prove once and for all that I was the better man. That my way, the careful, disciplined way, was the right one. The money I sent him, it was an investment, yes. But it was also my final word in an old argument." He set the knife and leather down and finally turned his head to look at her, his slate-colored eyes reflecting the fire. "I was a fool," he said, the admission stark and simple. His gaze drifted from her to the sleeping forms of the children, to the patched roof, to the quiet, sustained life of the cabin. "All this time I thought the argument was about who was right. I was measuring my life in ledgers and victories." He paused and his voice dropped to a near whisper. This is what matters." In the hushed stillness, the words landed with the weight of a cornerstone being laid. The last vestiges of the debtor-creditor facade, already cracked and crumbling, fell away completely, leaving nothing between them but the raw, unvarnished truth of two people who had been wronged by life, and by each other, finding an unexpected kinship in the ashes of their respective failures. The fire warmed their skin, but it was this shared reckoning that began to thaw the long-frozen places within them. The fragile piece they had built was as dry as the old, sun-bleached timber of the cabin walls. It took only a single errant spark to bring it all down. It happened deep in the night, in the silent, witching hour when the fire in the hearth had burned down to a bed of glowing coals. A pocket of sap in a log or perhaps a flaw in the stonework they could not see, it didn't matter the cause. The effect was a loud, sharp crack, like a gunshot in the stillness, followed by the horrifying sight of a burning ember, as big as a man's thumb, shooting out onto the rag rug Eliza had woven in a happier time. For a heart-stopping second, it merely smoldered, a single malevolent orange eye. Then, fanned by an unseen draft, it flared to life. The dry, ancient rags caught with a soft whoosh and flames, quick as serpents, raced up the leg of the rickety table and began to lick hungrily at the dry, resinous logs of the wall. Jacob was awake in an instant, the acrid scent of smoke pulling him from a shallow sleep. Fire. His roar was not one of panic but of raw, immediate command. "Everyone out. Now." Chaos erupted. The children, startled from sleep, began to cry. Eliza shot upright, her mother's instinct overriding her terror. She scooped the screaming baby from the cradle and shoved a disoriented Annie toward the door. "The twins? Get the twins!" she screamed at Jacob, her voice pitched high with animal-like terror. Jacob didn't hesitate. He surged to his feet, grabbing a twin under each arm like sacks of grain. The heat was already intensifying, the flames climbing the wall with terrifying speed, painting the cabin in a hellish, dancing orange light. He shoved Eliza and Annie, who was clutching a blanket, out the door into the biting cold of the night. He turned back. Tommy was frozen by the bed, paralyzed by fear, his small body racked by a coughing fit from the thick, black smoke now filling the cabin. "Tommy!" Jacob bellowed. The boy didn't move. Cursing, Jacob plunged back into the smoke, grabbing the boy by his nightshirt and half carrying, half dragging him toward the door. As he stumbled for the exit, his eyes, stinging and watering, swept the room one last time. They landed on the stool where his coat lay, and within it, the ledger. The book that had brought him here. The symbol of his entire purpose. It sat there, its fine leather cover beginning to blister from the intense heat. The choice was made in a fraction of a second, a lifetime of calculation overturned by a more primal imperative. He left the ledger. Instead, his hand shot out, grabbing a small heavy trunk he knew contained the children's few spare clothes, and he snatched the rifle from its place by the door. Then he stumbled out into the life-saving cold, pulling a choking Tommy with him. XT. Cabin night. The family huddled together in their nightclothes, a small, shivering island in a sea of snow. They watched, mesmerized by horror, as their home, their shelter, their last possession, the container of all their memories, was consumed. The flames roared, a triumphant, terrifying beast against the placid stars. The sound was a voracious crackling, interspersed with the groans of dying timber. Sparks shot into the black sky like a swarm of furious fireflies. Eliza clutched the baby to her chest, her body shaking with more than just cold. She was watching her past burn. The last physical remnants of Michael, the children's birth certificates, the few precious trinkets from a life before struggle, all of it turning to ash and smoke. Then the roof gave way with a great, sorrowful sigh, collapsing inward in a spectacular shower of sparks. The light from the blaze illuminated the stark devastation on their faces. They were alive, but they had nothing. No food, no blankets, no shelter from the killing cold that was already beginning to bite through their thin clothes. Without a word, Jacob moved. He set down the trunk and the rifle. He found a relatively clear patch of deep snow away from the flying embers and began to dig. He used his hands and then a piece of burning plank he pulled from the edge of the inferno, scooping out a pit in the snow. It was a crude, desperate shelter, but it would block the wind. He gestured for them to get in. Eliza herded the children into the snowy hollow, their teeth chattering uncontrollably. Then Jacob did the last thing any of them expected. He sat with his back to them at the edge of the pit, and pulled the salvaged blanket from the trunk over his own shoulders, creating a living windbreak. He spread his arms, using his own broad back and the blanket to shield them from the worst of the biting wind. He was their wall. The man who had come to take their home had now become it. As the fire began to die down, leaving only the skeletal, glowing remains of their cabin, the deep, trembling cold set in. Eliza, huddled with her children in the snow pit, looked at Jacob's silhouette against the dying embers. His shoulders were dusted with frost, his breath a steady, pluming cloud in the darkness. He did not speak, did not offer empty comfort. He simply endured with them. Her voice, when it came, was a raw whisper carried away on the wind, but he heard it. "Jacob," she said, the name feeling strange and new on her tongue. "The debt is paid." He didn't turn around, but after a long moment he gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. The fire had burned away the last of the contract, the last of the old life. All that remained was the truth of the cold, the stars, and the shared will to see the dawn. Spring did not come to the high country with a gentle sigh, but with a stubborn, muddy insistence. The snow retreated slowly, revealing the blackened, skeletal scar where the old cabin had stood. It was a permanent mark on the land, a memorial to what had been lost. But beside it life pushed back. A new, larger structure was rising, its raw pine frame standing straight and strong against the vast, bleached blue Wyoming sky. The sound that dominated the homestead was no longer the mournful wind, but the steady, percussive music of renewal, the rhythmic thwack of an axe, the scrape of a drawknife peeling bark from a log, and the solid thump of a mallet driving a wooden peg into a joint. Jacob Thorne, his hands calloused and ingrained with pine pitch, worked with a quiet, focused intensity. The city-sharp edges of the rancher who had arrived months ago had been worn away, replaced by the grounded strength of a homesteader. He was hewing a log, his muscles coiling and releasing with practiced efficiency. Eliza was beside him, no longer a spectator to another man's work, but a partner in it. She held the log steady, her own hands, once raw and chapped, now toughened and sure. Her face, though still lean, had lost its haunted, starved look. It was tanned by the spring sun, and in her eyes was a light that had nothing to do with desperation and everything to do with purpose. Nearby, Annie was playing a quiet game with the twins, their laughter occasionally ringing out, a sound that now belonged to this place. Tommy, tasked with the vital important job of fetching tools, would march back and forth with a seriousness that belied his 6 years, handing Jacob a chisel or a wedge with a solemn nod. It was a picture of shared labor, of a family not just of blood, but of forged circumstance. Eliza wiped a strand of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "The cattle agent from Cedar Creek came by while you were checking the trapline yesterday," she said, her voice calm and even. "He confirmed the price for the beaver pelts. It's enough for the glass for the windows and the new cast-iron stove." Jacob paused, the axe resting on his shoulder. He looked at the frame of the new house, then at the small, neat pile of furs that represented their first joint venture. "Good," he said, a simple word that carried the weight of shared accomplishment. He set the axe down carefully and turned to her. The easy silence that had grown between them now held a new tension, a positive and potent one. "Eliza," he began, his voice lower, more deliberate. "My ranch to the south, it's managed well. It has good men. It doesn't need me there every day to turn a profit." He paused, gathering his words like a man gathering stray timbers to build something essential. "But this place, it feels like it needs a future." Eliza stilled, her hands resting on the smooth, hewn wood. She looked at him, really looked at him, at the sun creases around his eyes, the quiet strength in his posture, the way his gaze was fixed on her, full of an unspoken question. "What are you saying, Jacob?" she asked, though in her heart she already knew. "I'm saying I'm not leaving." The declaration was simple, stark, and absolute. Not as a creditor. Not even as a partner in business. He took a step closer, his presence not intimidating but solid, like the foundation they stood upon. "As a partner." He didn't say the word, husband. He didn't need to. It hung in the clean, spring air between them, as tangible and real as the new house, full of promise and a shared, hard-won understanding. Eliza's gaze drifted from his earnest face. She looked at the new structure, its bones strong enough to withstand any storm. She looked at her children, their children in every way that mattered now, who were no longer just surviving but thriving, their faces filled with a security they had never known. She looked at the man who had arrived to take their home and had ended up helping them build a new one, not just of wood but of trust and mutual respect. She thought of the old ledger, consumed by the same flames that had tried to consume them. The numbers, the debt, the old grievances, all of it was just ash, fertilizer for this new beginning. A slow, genuine smile, the first he had ever seen from her that was entirely unburdened, touched her lips. She reached out and took his work-roughened hand in hers. This time the touch was not a bargain but a bond. Acclaiming. "We started a new ledger the day of the fire," she said, her voice soft but clear as the mountain stream that ran through their land. "Everything before that, it's just ash." The camera pulls back, soaring above the homestead. The black scar of the old cabin is a fading memory next to the vibrant, yellow promise of the new pine structure. The small, resilient family is etched into the landscape, not as victims of it, but as a part of its enduring story. Jacob and Eliza stand hand in hand, their figures silhouetted against the vast, hopeful sky. The harsh winter of 1887 was a trial by ice and fire, but the future, built on forgiveness and shared resilience, stood strong and waiting.